Hey everyone, welcome to the second second part of this lecture, of this video lecture. This is my first time doing a full video lecture, so bear with me as I try to, in case there's any technical difficulties or anything like that. What I'm going to do is, I think I know where I left off in class when we stopped. What I'm going to do is continue on. I've got my other laptop here. I've got my slides on there. I was going to try to get all fancy and have like the slides in the corner and me on one side or something and like some interaction between the two, but the midterm's on Wednesday and I should just get this done so you could have it. So it's going to be a little low tech, and welcome to my kitchen. And I'm going to be looking over at the slides over at my other laptop and coming back and forth. And so I would suggest, you guys can split screen or whatever you do best for studying purposes as you're going through this. I know that the midterm is coming up, and so on the one hand, this is kind of unfortunate that I'm giving you a new lecture of sorts on Saturday before the midterm. Rest assured of two things. One is that nothing to very little, I'm going to say, I don't want to promise nothing, but essentially very little of this content that I'm going to provide you in this video is truly new. The majority of this of the slides that I'm going to present to you now mirror the textbook, and so to some extent I could potentially not put this video together at all and just tell you guys just read the textbook and you'll be okay with that. But I think the lectures are, I hope the lectures are useful. I think the lectures are useful, even if they're mirroring the textbook to some extent. So rest assured, there's no, or at least very little new content that's going to come out of this that isn't already in the textbook chapter 8. I think it's 8 or 9, whichever the everyday memory chapter is. That isn't already in there. So number two then is that you can you don't need to watch this video. I would advise it. I'd suggest you do. But my purpose of giving you this video in the end is actually more as a study aid than as a way to provide new content to you. Again, I recognize that providing new content 5 days before the midterm is not ideal. It's also not ideal that we've had weather cancel 2 of our classes. I don't know why the weather has to keep happening on Wednesdays. But anyway, you can relatively interpret this lecture to be a study aid. Okay, so you might want to read it along with the textbook. You might want to have the textbook open while you're looking at this lecture, and you might want to just go through both of them for repetition's sake. Okay, all right, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to be relatively fast. I'm going to try to do this within about an hour. I've got the rest of my family is going to be coming home in about an hour, so they could walk in the door at any point in time. I'm going to hope to have this finished by then. And, I don't think there's any need for it to go on longer than that. So without further ado, welcome to the online lecture, and I'm going to begin. So where I left off, and I reckon, again, this is pretty low tech, so I kind of apologize, but where I left off, in the last lecture, I believe, I'm just going to show you the screen. Here's really, you guys can't even read that, can you? No, not really. Okay, so where I left off was talking about the 7 sins of memory, and I think I began talking about the difference between omission and commission, the fact that we're going to talk mainly about commission during this lecture, that omission we've already relatively talked about. That the omission errors of transience being decay, blocking being interference, and absent-mindedness being attentional influences of some kind. So we're going to talk mainly about commission today, and most of this lecture is going to be going through examples of real-world examples of the ways in which everyday memory, of which there are commission errors that occur in everyday memory, the types of commission errors that occur, and when and to some extent how they occur. Okay, so I think where I actually left off was talking about last year's results on the false memory cog lab. And so I'm going to begin this lecture on slide, I've got it numbered as 13. It might be a different number in your online slides. I can't remember now. But it's the slide entitled Bartlett's War of the Ghosts, okay? And comes right after the false memory CogLab results. So that's where I'm going to begin. Bartlett's War of the Ghost is really just an example of a classic study, sort of the very first official study that was done that really demonstrated this, the commission errors that can occur in long-term memory. And so in Bartlett's War on the Ghosts, there was a very simple experiment where participants were provided with a story. I think the next slide, no, I don't have the story in here, but the story was a cultural story about natives and Indians and ghosts in the woods and whatnot. And what he did was he gave this story to people from different cultures, very different cultures. And what he found was that over time, the telling of the story became shorter, more concise. Less of the specific details were remembered. And so that you can take as some indication of transience, of the transient nature of memory, or of the natural decay of memory. The fact that some of the details began to disappear. And also there were some omissions and there were some inaccuracies. And by the inaccuracies, we would refer to those as commissions. So, but in particular, it was there were various aspects of this study that were a little more interesting than just our broken telephone, which essentially is what this is. This is sort of an official study that demonstrates broken telephone over time. There were a few things that made it a little more interesting, and it was the specific aspects of the commission errors that were made, the ways in which they were made, that told a little bit more about how long-term memory functioning works. The first was that people from different cultures started coming up with different inaccuracies. So they went on different lines, and the people from one culture would start to add in, forget information from time A, from topic A. Oh. And the people from culture B would remember and misremember information from other types from the other topics. And so what this demonstrates, first of all, is that past information is being used to construct memory in a fairly personal sense. And so what it indicates is not just that our memory is not just a videotape of what has happened in the past, but it's really a personalized construction of our past. And it adds in the types of information that we omit and commit is personalized and is sort of subjective and is constructed based on our past experiences. Okay, and so a couple other examples of this type of reconstruction effect are on the next slides after War of the Ghosts. And these are in your textbook, and these are just fairly classic examples, again, really simple studies that demonstrate this reconstruction effect of memory. And so on 2 slides down from War of the Ghosts that I was on before is a slide that says Gerald Martin, in red, strove to undermine the existing government to satisfy his political ambitions. Many of the people in his country supported his efforts. And you'll notice 1 slide down from that is the same slide, essentially, but the name has changed. The name in red has changed, and the name is now Adolf Hitler instead of Gerald Martin. You can see that the content of this very simple paragraph is exactly the same. And so in terms of the details that could and should be remembered, if memory was just a carbon copy, just a videotape of our past, the type of information that should be remembered in these 2 paragraphs should really be identical. Decay should be the same, the transient nature, all the errors of omission should be the same, interference, if there is any, should be similar across the 2. What we find, though, is that people actually do have quite different memories for these 2 paragraphs. The only difference between the 2 of them is the name of the person. And so, again, this is some evidence we have some prior knowledge of Adolf Hitler, not any prior knowledge, most likely, of Gerald Martin. And so what this is demonstrating is that our memory for this paragraph, again, is not just a carbon copy, it's not just a memorization of what we've read. over time, it becomes mixed with our prior experiences and reconstructed into a memory that makes the most sense for us. So I talked in the false memory Cog Lab that you guys are doing for this week, actually, and that I talked about the results of before, where I mentioned in the last video that you could do door, window, house, whatnot, and then there is an error of commission where if you put a word that's related to that topic but wasn't in the original list, that it gets often remembered as being in the list. And that's the same concept, is we're reconstructing our memories in a way that helps us to make sense of things. And so again, the main point here is memories are reconstructions, not carbon copies. Okay, same example. Carol Harris was a problem child from birth. She was wild, stubborn, and violent. Or Helen Keller was a problem child from birth. She was wild, stubborn, and violent. In this case, the sentence with Helen Keller just doesn't match with our preconceived notions of what we understand about Helen Keller. Now, I don't know Helen Keller personally, and obviously none of you do either. So who knows how accurate it actually is? But it's not in line with our preconceived understanding of what Helen Keller would have been like. And so what's found is that we have a much harder time remembering these types of details about an individual like Helen Keller. And we'd have a much easier time understanding these details when we talk about a new person, in this case Carol Harris. And if I were to put Adolf Hitler into this sentence, then the ability for our memories to be reconstructed would change again. Memory for these events might improve, and also, so you can see a week later, in this case, students were then asked questions about the sentence, was she deaf, dumb, and blind? Was deaf, dumb, and blind included in the passage? And what you can see is here, 50% of people said it was included if it was about Helen Keller. And so that demonstrates, and yet the sentence has nothing to do with that, right? Nothing to do with deaf, dumb, and blind. And so you can see again how we're using our preconceived notions, a preconceived understanding, or you can think of it as our preconceived memories for Helen Keller in terms of trying to understand and recognize whether the information was in that sentence. Now I'll anticipate a little bit what's coming next. One of the errors of commission is misattribution, otherwise known as a source monitoring error. And what that is an error in terms of remembering where and when you heard a particular piece of information. So you might know that it's true that Helen Keller was deaf, dumb, and blind, but you can't remember where you remember it from. And so often that is one of the reasons that leads to errors of commission, and that's probably the reason that's leading to this reconstruction effect in this case. Not always a source. Reconstruction does not always occur because of a source monitoring error, but that is one potential cause. We'll talk about a few more potential causes as we continue on. Okay. Oh, well, here we go. Next slide. Source monitoring. So then I've sort of told you about this already. But so source monitoring is then the monitoring of the source of a given piece of information. And if we have a source monitoring error, as I just indicated, we remember the information. We know it, but we can't remember where we know it from, or we misattribute where we know it from. So again, in the Helen Keller example, we know she's deaf, dumb, and blind. We remember that she's deaf, dumb, and blind, but we misattribute that information as being in the sentence the paragraph we read about her before, even though it wasn't there and had nothing to do with her. And so somehow our preconceived notions are getting mixed together, and we're making a misattribution or a source monitoring error. Okay, another example of this, and this is a very famous example, again, in your textbook. So again, all of this is review, and you should use it as a study aid as you read through the textbook. If there's anything, as I come across these slides, if there's anything that is new, I'll point it out. But otherwise, it's all going to be in your text. So another very, very well-known example is the famous person effect. And this is a study that was done by Jacobi in 1989. He referred to it as the becoming famous overnight experiment. And so you can see in the slide that the study is designed so that in what's referred to as an acquisition phase, or essentially it's just a viewing phase. They're viewing, in some cases they're viewing pictures of faces, in some cases they're viewing names of faces. In this example, it says they're reading non-famous names. So in this case, there's names of people like Gerald Martin and Susan Albright, whoever. And they read all of these non-famous names. There's then a test. Okay, a memory test. And in that memory test, immediately afterwards, they read all the non-famous names from the acquisition, plus new non-famous names and new famous names like Barack Obama, Michael Jordan, whatever, famous names. And so in the test, they are asked to pick out